In today's World Insight with Wei, pledge towards a shared future between two old civilization states. What's next for China-Greece ties? And Latin America doing business in China. What it means, in the words of ministers from Argentina and Costa Rica. Here's our host, Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin in Athens, where China and Greece have signed a total of 16 business agreements. Chinese President Xi Jinping kicked off the three-day state visit on Sunday. It's the first visit by a Chinese leader to Greece in 11 years. President Xi had talks with the Greek president and the prime minister of the country. During the talks, the leaders have touched on something that both countries share: deep history with civilization that date back to ancient times. In a joint media conference with visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping, he and the Greek Prime Minister expressed the importance of working together on the Belt and Road Initiative. Take a listen.
Both sides see China and Greece as natural partners for building the Belt and Road. We would like to mesh the Belt and Road Initiative more closely with the development strategy of this country. We look forward to implementing cooperation plans in priority areas and to fully leverage the transshipment role of the Port of Piraeus and to further strengthen the transportation capacity of the China-Europe Land-Sea Express Line. I'm sure we'll make the most of the Joint Committee on Economy and Trade and continually expand two-way trade and mutual investment and to unleash the potential in energy, transportation and financial cooperation.
And this marks the important thing in the day. I'm talking about the signing of 16 government and business agreements between Greece and China and many levels and many different sectors. So this is a road that we've now opened, but this road will soon become a highway because our bilateral collaboration will become even stronger.
So what's the potential of China and Greece ties, and what does it mean for the European continent and beyond? We are joined in Brussels by Peter Klepp, who is the head of the Brussels office of Open Europe, and in our Beijing studio, Wang Yiwei, the Jean Monnet Chair Professor and Director of the Center for European Studies at the Renmin University of China. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Professor Wang, a lot to be celebrated between China and Greece, and this time, the port, the deep sea port, is of quite significance, Professor.
Definitely, this is a flagship project under the Belt Road Initiative. Originally, I think it's China's investment during the Greece debt crisis serious period because of the privatization, and China's investment cost from Costco make this the port from the bankruptcy now to #1 in the Mediterranean Sea, ranking from number 93 now to number, I think, 32 in the world. So I think it's contribute directly at least 3,000 jobs, and indirectly 10,000. So they contribute a lot for the local, because of the port connect now the North Africa, Middle East and Europe, and also contribute to the south-north logistic link. Traditionally, the Europeans logistically is more from the Hamburg and Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and to the from the west to the east. So the South European countries, Central Middle countries, they are suffer. So logistic costs is quite high. So this is very good for the 17+ line population.
And Mr. Klepp, of course, that probably means more opportunities and also competitions for Rotterdam and also some of the ports in Germany as well. So how do you see that, the rise of Piraeus in Greece as one important port as it used to be?
Well, competition is of course a good thing, and Greece is definitely a country that could use a lot of investment. So it's no surprise that Greece is very keen to have closer ties with China. There is a lot of unease, however, about this, both at the EU level and in the United States. The US has been claiming that some countries go into debt too deeply to China, which then gives leverage to China. The EU is not happy with this so-called 16+1 cooperation, so basically Central and Eastern European countries that have set up a certain format to have closer ties with China.
I see.
Now, I think ultimately, as long as countries make sure that they don't go into debt excessively, then I mean, it's of course a great idea to have closer trade ties with anyone, and certainly with China, which is one of the major economic powers of today.
Mr. Klepp, I'm sure you are informed about the speech made by the Greek Prime Minister when he was attending the China International Import Expo. The Prime Minister from Greece particularly talked about the debt issue, in which he illustrated that the earlier heavy debt shouldered by Greece as a result of its economic challenges has become much less than it used to be so far. So it's kind of interesting to see a Greek perspective. We were hoping also to be able to connect to some of the panelists in Greece. For now, we're still working on the telecommunication issue. But Professor Wang, let me go to you also about that. You know, there are certain perceptions involving China's interaction with the European countries, including this time the cooperation on port areas in Greece. So how do you see these debates, both inside the EU and so-called warnings coming from other parts of the world?
Well, European Union, 28 countries, but actually 17 of them, including Greece, suffered with the less development in recent years. So-called two words, the developing country or developed country, even in the European Union. So those countries actually, they cannot pay much attention to Brussels because Brussels suffered a debt crisis. So they look to the east. So more the Chinese investment can contribute the job creation and also tax. Also, it's good for the long-term economic prosperity and the mutual connectivity. But in total, actually, for instance, in the Greece, I think the FDI they attract from abroad, China's investment only 1%. So it's very limited. So still a huge space. So that's more the need investment from not just from China, from European Union, other countries as well.
So it's kind of interesting to see the different opinions inside the EU, but of course it is really the countries themselves that really count the most. Mr. Klepp, according to the latest statistics coming from a survey done by some of the U.S. survey groups, talking about China is most favored in the eyes of Greece, only next to some of the other Eastern European countries. So 51% actually in Greece favor China. It's interesting to see how you know, China is being seen in different countries by different people in different ways, Mr. Klepp.
Yes, that's very much the case. If you look at this so-called 16+1 cooperation, so Central and Eastern European countries, there Greece is actually more keener to work with China than some other of these countries, which had initially hoped to enjoy more Chinese investment than ultimately appeared. But also within the EU, for example, France takes a slightly different view. The French President Macron has been to China just recently, and there he also brought up other issues than just trade. He was talking about the Uyghuric minority in China, of course also the complaints that intellectual property in China is not sufficiently protected. So indeed these are aspects that other countries care a lot more about. A recent issue is of course also 5G. The fears that that 5G is not just economical but also political, and then how can China then reassure European countries that it's actually about economics. So these are indeed topics that that are perhaps more prevalent in France, the UK, Germany than in Greece.
These are topics that are appearing in some of the headlines, but it seems that very different countries have very different views, but at the same time, collectively, the EU has not ruled out any specific country or any specific company around the world in terms of who will be the provider of the 5G. In fact, for now, 5G is mainly Huawei, a company that is based, headquartered in China. Both the German Chancellor and also many of the European dignitaries, presidents and prime ministers, who have been spoken over the past few weeks have once again touched upon that there has been no ruling out of any specific country and any specific company. So let me go now to a voice really coming from Greece rather than from elsewhere in Europe. In Athens, we have George Zougopoulos, who's a senior research fellow and also director of the EU-China programs at the Centre International de Formation Europe. I hope I pronounce the name of your institute right, because this is in Greek. But for now, sir, it's good to have you on our program. Let me ask you about the immediate reaction to the latest rounds of state visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping, and also interactions between the Greek and also the Chinese leaders.
Thank you for having me today.
It's a pleasure.
It is a very important day for Greece, and please allow me to start with this. It is a state visit from a Chinese president after 11 years. It is very important for the future of the bilateral relationship, as well as for Sino-European relations. So far, we have experienced a very good climate in bilateral talks. Several agreements and memoranda of understanding have been signed, so we can be optimistic about the future. And what is very important is to look at the bilateral partnership beyond the Chinese investment in the Piraeus port, which has been very successful. But now it's time for the two countries to look at additional areas of cooperation on energy, telecommunications, culture, education and tourism. And it is clear that President Xi Jinping and Greek Premier Mitsotakis are determined to proceed.
Now, when you look at the areas which you touch on, whether it's telecommunication or tourism, there actually is energy as well, a lot of ground to cover. For example, Professor Wang, if I could invite a Chinese voice also in this discussion. Professor Wang, 170,000 Chinese tourists every year to Greece now, but that number is expected to increase even further. What would that mean for an economy like that of Greece, and how will that create better people-to-people relationship and understanding? It's not just about the cash. It's really about how do you feel about the other countries. Professor Wang.
Yes, as President Xi has said in his visit, I think Greece represents the ancient European civilization, China, Eastern civilization. So our two Asian civilizations shake hands and also contribute to innovation, and more and more people exchange that they contribute, I think, learn from each other, because today's world we suffer so many crises, uncertainty, so we need more to learn from the Asian civilization. So people-to-people exchange is not just for tourists, it's not just for our economy, it's also about maybe the second renaissance, and East and West shake hands to contribute to the community of shared future, which the
it might be a little bit too early to announce that they will be two civilizations once again, but certainly it's one of the very first steps. If you think about what Europe has suffered over the past few years in terms of division, in terms of challenges to their economies. But Mr. Zougopoulos, of course, people are also looking at the interests of Greece. also. Earlier we had Mr. Klepp coming from the EU trying to suggest that maybe the Greece should take more advantage of this relationship. Now, what do you think is the best way in this regard about a cooperation relationship between China and Greece? What is the realistic expectation coming from Greece about the potential? Mr. Zoukopoulos.
Well, I think that the sky is the limit for the bilateral partnership, and the fact that President Xi Jinping is currently in Athens highlights that China wants to do more with Greece, and obviously Greece is interested in doing more with China. We need to mention that Greece is an EU member state. It respects all EU guidelines in receiving investment from China. So from the moment this is happening, why not? More can happen. And that's why Greek citizens and Greek politicians are optimistic about the future. And the memoranda of understanding that have been signed until now highlight that in the future we can expect more indeed, especially in the areas I mentioned before. But of course we should not sideline issues such as tourism, education and culture.
Well, if I could just bring in Mr. Klepp coming from what he considers as the EU perspective as well. Will Greece, for example, be a new frontier in terms of what to do and how to deal with China? And what could be some of the potential of cooperation between Europe or the European countries of the EU and China? Mr. Klepp, what do you think about that possibility?
I think that's a good point. I think Greece is indeed, let's say, on the forefront of cooperation with China. So indeed, the way Greece fares with China will probably determine how other European countries in the future will relate to China. If indeed Greece, let's say, starts taking huge loans from China, I do think that would be a warning sign. However, if the relationship is purely commercial, then of course indeed the sky is the limit. The more cooperation, the better.
Okay.
Of course, we should still not forget that other European countries, like notably Germany, has already a lot of economic interaction with China. So that's of course also the case.
Yeah, Mr. Zoukopoulos, of course, Mr. Klepp seemed to be more concerned about the debt issue than you in Greece about Greece's future. You want to respond to that?
Well, let me be very clear about this. What is happening is that Greece was under pressure by its creditors, mainly the European Union and the International Monetary Fund, to proceed with privatizations. So transparent tenders were organized, and in some cases only Chinese companies submitted offers. So what Greece could do? Exclude the Chinese companies because they come from China? Let us be very realistic about the past and about the future. What Greece did was completely in line with the regulations of the European Union, and Greece is a member state which respects the guidelines. I don't understand the concern. From the moment Chinese investments in Greece only represent approximately 1% of the Chinese investments in the European Union.
Got it. Professor Wang, you have anything to say about that?
I agree with my Greek colleague. I think that everything because of from China, and the state-owned enterprises, Costco, and everything because Communist Party, so blame everything. But what do the Greek people need? What do the Greek economy really need? I think what the European really need, I think it's more infrastructure building, more mutual connectivity. Now the port, not just connect the sea and the land, but also help the Serbia and Hungary. There's a railway and extend to the south and connect with the support. This is very good for the China-European Union mutual connectivity collaboration.
Right. But, before we go, we have 1.5 minutes left. The three gentlemen, may I ask you about, this is only the first step, the port periods and also the cooperation between China and Greece. And how should we use this as an interesting model if we look at the future, whether it's about Belt and Road cooperation between China and Greece and China and Europe, or some of the other areas when we think about these two very strong economies, that of the European Union and that of China, and certainly Greece is a big and important part of that. Mr. Zoukopoulos, you want to come in first? Very briefly, 30 seconds for every one of you.
Yes, there is a lack of understanding of China in the West, both in the European Union and in the United States. So I think that the successful presence of China in Greece can give important lessons, especially to the European Union. So Greece can be a bridge between the West and the East, and it can really suggest to its partners at the EU level that China cannot be a threat.
Mr. Klepp, Mr. Tsokopoulos already signed that kind of image to Greece. So what do you think will be the potential? 30 seconds.
Well, I think ultimately there is no EU-China trade deal already, so I think at some point that could be a very good thing to achieve. But for that, both sides will have to make major concessions.
I see. Last but not least, Professor Wang, 30 seconds.
The early birds get the one, so I think Greece benefit first.
We got a lot of ancient wisdoms coming over here, whether it's the sky is the limit, the early birds got the worm, or as deep as the sea. Anyway, for now, I want to thank the three of you for joining us. George Tsokopoulos from Greece, Piet Klepp coming from the EU, and Mr. Wang Yue from China. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program, Latin America doing business in China. What it means in the words of ministers from Argentina and Costa Rica, right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. The program is coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. The second China International Import Expo wrapped up in Shanghai on Sunday, marking the conclusion of one of China's biggest business events of the year. As buyers came in and out of the crowded pavilions, deals worth more than $71 billion were signed this year, assuring encouragement for businesses looking to enter the Chinese market. China is the top importer for many countries' agricultural products, such as those from Argentina. So how does global uncertainty affect Argentina, and what can the country do in terms of cooperation in agricultural sector with China? Earlier, I talked to the Argentinian agriculture minister in Shanghai. Here's the conversation. What does it mean, the China market, for agriculture in Argentina?
Well, it means a lot because our economies are complementary. So we produce a lot of food. Today we are producing over 10 times what we need for our population. We produce for over 400 million people, we produce food, and we are only 44 inhabitants in our country. So we can be a very good supplier of food for countries like China.
Now we have seen some conflict. But at the same time, it also could mean potential of opening up as big a market as China. And how eager is Argentina in this regard?
We would like to see that all the countries can find a solution to their conflicts, because the best way to do businesses is when you don't have conflicts.
When you have win-win.
Win-win situation, multilateral commerce based on rules. So when everybody have what they need, and everybody can get a profit with this relation in two ways. So this is the ideal, no? But I think that probably in a short time we can have a quiet situation, and this is very important to develop the best commercial relationship between the countries.
But you know, agriculture sometimes are the areas where in some countries protectionism could be high. How do you, as the Minister of Agriculture, see this, at least some political trend in certain countries?
Signing agreements. Yes. This is the best way.
As simple as that.
The best way, because the other face of the coin of the protectionism is the agreement. When you sign an agreement, your people, your farmers, know very well what will happen on the future. And if you have an agreement, you have a contract, a free trade agreement, for example, no, everyone knows how to produce, or what do you have to produce to have a future on the production. So this, for us, it's the best way. That's why we talk about multilateral commerce based on rules. One of the more strong rule is to have an agreement between the countries, no, to have very clear rules.
WTO negotiations, for example, Mr. Minister, yes. You know that very well, that sometimes agricultural issue becomes the very core issue, because it could be also a domestic political issue as a result of elections and things. So how do you see when you are saying, you know, let's have agreements?
Yes,
from
insisting.
No agreement to having agreement? Probably this is the most difficult part.
Working. Well, look, I give you another example. We just signed an agreement with Europe, between Europe and Mercosur. Well, it takes 20 years of negotiation. But finally, we finished all the negotiation, and now we know that in a couple of years we will have very clear rules for our commerce between the two blocks. No? And that's why we are convinced that this is the way.
So it's about making the cake bigger.
Yes, of course, the cake bigger, and many times together, for example, between Argentina and China, think in third markets.
Yes.
Join efforts to reach other markets.
Argentina is well known for its agriculture, but on the one hand, you have great agricultural development. On the other hand, how would you look at the sustainable development and protecting of the environment? We do have some lessons that we can learn in some of the recent case studies and news stories. So how do you see that combination, the right balance?
Well, for example, we developed 30 years ago a technique, is entail system. We don't remove the soil to seed the crops. So we reduce 50% the consumption of oil, for example, of gas oil, yes. Yeah. More than that, we are now working with gene editing in the seeds. So with this technology, we can handle the climate change because we have new varieties against the flood, against the drought, no, or the changing weather we have today.
What the developing countries and emerging economies together, Argentina included in this sense? Of course, you have been very developed economy for quite some time, but certainly you are still a rising economy in Latin America. To be able to work on multilateral platforms, you know, as individual countries, you have your own concerns and your advantages, but how to work together among this group?
Cooperation, I think is the word. The individualism is not the way, and it's very proof that one country is isolated, can do nothing. So we have to look for partners. We have to the globalization is a reality. Nobody can change that. We have to live with this, and the best way is, well, you have to do what you do best, and your neighbor can supply you other things, and together can supply other one, and then with this commerce the economy improves, and that helps to improve the quality of life of our people.
That was my conversation earlier with the Argentinian Agriculture Minister on the sideline of the China International Import Expo. Let's now turn to Costa Rica, from where a number of food makers came to take part in this year's Import Expo with products such as coffee and others. Having signed a free trade agreement with China, Costa Rica is also one of the first Central American countries to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Earlier, I talked to Costa Rican Minister of Foreign Trade, Diela Jimenez Figueres, about the benefits of better cooperation. Take a look. Costa Rica have been working with China for quite some time. Belt and Road, you're very proud about the early bird, in a way, being an early bird. So how is it now?
So we were the first country to establish diplomatic relations with China in Central America, and also to have an FTA, a free trade agreement. And then we did the Belt and Road Initiative as well. So we have a privileged status and relationship with China. And what we see is all full of opportunities.
But what about the Belt and Road? How from paper to on the ground?
Well, a lot of it is in cooperation. And so the Foreign Affairs Ministry, my colleagues, are taking care of that part of the Belt and Road. Other parts of infrastructure are also taken care of by my other colleagues in the ministry. We are very focused on the trade aspect with our FTA, and we are excited to be here. That is why this is our second year at the CIE.
And of course, Costa Rica regards China as an important trading partner, second largest.
Indeed, it's a very important trading partner, and not only for our imports, of course, but also our exports. They have been growing 20% each year since our FTA in 2011.
So it really works.
It really works, and we have to make it work even more. We're getting new certification for new products, fresh products to come into the market.
Like what?
Like we have a frozen fruit and dehydrated fruit, and pork is special kind of pork that is very wonderful in demand in the market in China.
Well, the bilateral trade is going on well. Multilaterally, there are a lot of challenges, as you may know, as the Minister for Trade. Madam Minister, globally, WTO is one of the things people talk about. Regionally, whether there's enough efficient platforms for powers in the region to work together, whether it's in Central America or other parts of the world. What do you make of this current situation?
I think you're right, and we cannot divide multilateralism from regionalism. So that is why at the CIE we had the ministerial rounds, the informal gatherings, and we are discussing where should we take the WTO reforms. And in terms of regional trade and development, so we have to start thinking of new avenues in plurilateralism and start negotiating e-commerce and other modern and from the fourth industrial revolution point of view. We cannot leave this behind. We also have to really work on the appellate body and dispute settlement mechanism. But in terms of region and your question, I see that we are forming regional value chains. And this is an opportunity.
Do you see that, if I could continue a bit on the WTO discussion, there could be even bigger chaos before things are settled down? Do we have to really let realities bite even bitter before we come to a path of cooperation?
I would not speak of chaos, actually. I think that this is normal. We are talking about an institution whose governance was created for a much smaller group of countries. And now the countries are not only more numerous, but the countries have changed in their development status. So we are accommodating this new reality to an old structure. And we have to find ways to agree on how to accommodate. And that takes time. I think it is normal that, you know, so many members need time to establish the new ideas and the new structure.
But you know, growing pains, as they say, it's really important as to who will feel the pains. You know, multilateral framework as it works, because it needs to provide particularly smaller, quote-unquote, players' interest. Otherwise, big powers take all, right? That's how it works. Costa Rica, as a geographically relatively smaller country, how do you look at this so-called growing pain of the global system?
Yes, I think you are right in the term growing pains, and what I take is the growing part. We have been really
I love it. You always are an optimistic person, Madam Minister.
Well, you know, we have gained so much from open trade, and I think trade is not only just the commercial aspect, it's friendship, it's bridges and cooperation. So being a small country, in the last 23 years when we created our policy, we have understood that we need to diversify. And we have diversified. We have a huge and rich platform of 15 free trade agreements with more than 50 partners. So we have definitely gained. And certainty is something that we need, and that now this is something that we're cherishing, but it will come to a good ground, I am sure.
Latin America or Central America is being regarded as so-called the backyard of certain countries. At least they want to believe so. So how would you be able to keep this balance in a way? Because you're having China as a very important trading partner, but certainly geographically you have another very important trading partner. You see what's happening with Canada, what's happening with Mexico. Does it ring an alarm bell to you?
Well, our advantage, Tian Wei, is that we have certain characteristics that stand out.
Tell me more about it.
Sure, we have decarbonization plans. So any investor coming to our country that connects to our electric grid has already clean energy, and that can be part of their targets for carbon neutrality or lowering their carbon print. That is something advantageous. We also have a strategic location. We have political stability, we have no army, and we have good talent. So I think that we are only looking at the opportunities. Of course, things like Nicaragua's situation and Venezuela's situation have damaged us. Central America is 20% of our exports, and we must take care of the diversification. If our exporters cannot sell to Nicaragua or Venezuela, we must find other markets. So I think with China, this will really help us grow.
Well, you are focusing on the real job. There are others who try to work on the vulnerable. So how do you see this really murky water right now?
I think that if you have very clear what your vision and your objectives are as a government, and our President Alvarado has that, and then you focus on that work, you must just keep going and keep pushing. And I think that is part of the long-term planning. And I want to compare with President Xi's policy, for example, of establishing this import expo when the time was right for the country to establish it. And I think we in Costa Rica need to know when the moment is right for each change.
What about what's going on in the Asia-Pacific region, Madam Minister? You see the RCEP, certainly it's a regional free trade agreement being signed recently between ASEAN members and some of the major economies, Japan, South Korea, China, Australia, New Zealand, just to name a few. So will this be a trend that you would be watching from afar about Asia-Pacific, which is one of the rising regions, certainly in the world, about trade?
Certainly. I think on the one hand, I think it's very positive for the trading system because it is a trust and confidence in trade agreements and in regional partnerships. Of course, India will have open doors and maybe in the future they will join, but I think this is very important. And in Asia Pacific, I see this wonderful trend of the regional global, the regional value chains that are being formed. And I think it's very important to understand where the trends are moving, and we in Costa Rica need to understand that as well.
But you know, Madam Minister, there are so many uncertainties these days. You are dealing with trade, but you are talking also constantly to businesses coming from your country. So how would you communicate them about the uncertainties in business environment? And where is the stabilizing factor?
I think the stabilizing factor a lot is in policy making and government.
Or governance.
And governance. And I think that we in Costa Rica are doing one of the things that is very positive is we are in the process of becoming an OECD member in the Organization for Economic and Cooperation Development, because that means that we will understand how to better govern ourselves and become a more fact-driven in policy making. And that creates a lot of certainty and assurance, not only for trade, but for social well-being. So this balance is very important.
We see China at the opening ceremony of the CIE, for example, the government is trying to announce once again more opening up policies and determination about that, protection intellectual property rights and things like that. So how do you see an economy like China, you know, from your own perspective, not just about bilateral, but rather China as a concept and China as a phenomenon?
I think China is a wonderful phenomenon of an orderly evolution of how a country can plan and has a vision and take that vision into action in very careful steps, and how a government builds a narrative that is understood by the people. So I think it's a good example for other countries such as Costa Rica, how to set ourselves goals, long-term and middle-term goals, and explain them in order for everyone to join in those efforts.
Trade and governance, those issues are really interconnected. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel as well. Also, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world.